Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, welcome back to my lecture. So today we are going to talk about public choice, and in our previous lecture we began our discussion on public productions of the private goods, and there different categories that we spoke about, different in terms of commodities, and also there we spoke in details about natural monopolies, and then we also tried to understand what is the price strategies when goods are elastic, when goods are inelastic, and in that particular case how government will intervene in terms of production, especially government's role in the productions of goods and services. So we discussed this in our last class in detail. So today we are going to talk about public choice in details. So here public mechanism for resource allocation is very important. First, to understand what we actually mean by public mechanisms. So market equilibrium in the private market. So that is again we need, and we are discussing in details in almost every lecture, that equilibrium under perfect competitive, where demand and supply they are intersecting with each other. So this is primarily we need to remember when we are talking about economics of public policy. And here public policy that we are considering as a commodity which has the demand as well as the supply. Supply, who supplies, is basically government supplies. In that particular case we are trying to understand the nature of equilibrium. So the reference point that we are talking about is basically the equilibrium point where demand and supply intersect at each other, but then in the private market, and then how it looks like in the private market, and what is the deviation from that, and then how it will look like in the public sector. So now when we talk about resource allocation in the private sector, there are a couple of points and a couple of questions actually rather that we really need to remember. The first point that we are highlighting, that individuals vote for elected representatives. So when we are talking about public policy as a commodity, so it's basically people's demanding for commodity. So as we know that when we demand for any commodity, and if commodity is XYZ, like any sort of commodities like electricity, or say any commodities like say garments or shoes or clothes or steel or say any other, or we can consider that public good is like say water, clean water provided by the government, and that is the campaign, and that is one of the agenda points for the government or electoral to actually campaign for the vote in during the election. So then individual will imagine those particular commodities like publicly produced private goods like water, electricity. So those will be considered as a commodity, will be treated as commodity, and those are nothing is basically outcome of the public policy campaign. So individuals generally do not vote for people, they will vote for the elected representative, and of course not directly to the people, but then of course people who are actually or electoral candidates who are offering those commodities. So indirectly people are actually voting for the commodity, not for the people. So that is very very important for us to understand while framing the policy, as well as when we understand economics of public policy. So which point that we are considering part of the public policy? Is it people? No, it is actually the commodity that we are referring here. So when individuals vote for elected representatives, and then elected representatives vote for public budget, like they will design the public budget for allocating the resources over different commodities, and that is where resource allocation in the public sector that happens. and it could be for any sort of private goods as well, or other public goods like roadways, bridge, or any other or schools or public health care. The second point that we also need to understand, the money itself is spent by a variety of administrative agencies. It is not only about the people. When budget gets sanctioned or budget gets allocated, then that will be actually spread over across various administrative agencies and the offices, and that's how resource will be allocated and program will be implemented, and people will be getting the commodities that they voted for. So major difference between how an individual decides to spend money, their own money, and how political parties decide to spend the public's money. So there is a difference, right? So when we are talking about individuals' money and spending, it is basically individual's budget, and individual budget has the constant, and individual has their own utility, and that particular utility has to be tangent to overall individual's budget. So we get the equilibrium point. On the other hand, political parties decide to spend the public money, and public money is like through budget, is basically the revenue, and then public utility as well as public budget, and then there will be tangent point, and that's how even in the society we will get the equilibrium point where public utility curve is tangent to public budget. The fourth point, the vote for member of a party is supposed to reflect the views of constituents, not just the representatives' own view. So that is what we actually discussed in our initial lectures, where we said that when people, especially leaders, when they are the elected members, they are not just an individuals, they are actually representatives, and their views is not their only views, is basically for overall views. And then even while decision making to produce certain goods, it does not only reflect of everybody's views, but sometimes it is also like one individual's or leader's views that, okay, I want to introduce this particular commodity as a mission to to the country, and that's how it gets. Even despite there is no consensus of the views on that particular commodity. So when we say that public policy, generally by definition it is basically for the public and by the public, and by the public is like implemented by the elected members, and elected members are actually by the public. So these are the important points that we really need to understand when we talk about equilibrium and also resource allocations. So when we are talking about, just to summarize this particular discussion, when we are talking about market for public goods or private goods, so if it is like utility possibilities, and here we see the social indifference curve, and here utility possibilities curves. So here they are actually meeting at say point E. So at point E, that two utility for two people, like say U1 for A and UB. So this utility for others should be meeting at each other at point E. So it's basically the tangent point where utility possibilities are tangent with social indifference curve at point E. So this is what we are talking about, public mechanisms for allocating resources. So it's very important from the economics point of view, it's very important to understand that particular conditions where they are tangent, like for economics, for economists, especially in economics, this point E is very important, at what point this resource allocations are actually tangent with the social indifference, means social public utilities point of view, right? So now there is a resource allocation problems as well. So the problem of preference revelations is very difficult for public or individuals to reveal its preferences. For instance, when we ask like which particular commodity that you want, and they say there are two political parties, they are campaigning. One is campaigning for say free educations and free health, The other one is, other party is campaigning for cash transfer, direct cash transfer to the household, as well as better physical infrastructure like road. So now when we try to ask to the people which party that you are trying to vote for, then obviously people will not reveal. Even if we say that which product that you want to vote for, then we as an individual, even if we don't mention that political parties, but if I am mentioning that I am voting for, say, person A is voting for or person A is revealing that I am voting for public health, and person B is revealing for I am voting for road. So it is basically through the commodities it will be revealed that which person is actually going for which party. So it is very difficult, I mean, for individuals, and therefore individual cannot reveal which commodity that they are voting for or which parties that they are actually voting for. So that is a problem of preferences revelation, and therefore we always see that sometimes exit poll, for instance, it goes so bad as per the actual election results. So this is like, even in the exit poll people will not be very comfortable what they actually and for whom they vote for and what they actually vote for. So neither commodity will come nor by the people. So maybe we can say that you don't mention about the people that you have voted for, but then we also should not ask which commodity that you have voted for from the economics point of view, because that will be there in a preference revelation problem. The second point that we'd like to discuss is like differences in individual preferences for public goods. So even when we are saying that public goods should be the major main commodity for any sort of elections and then its outcome, so there are two ways. One is, of course, some set of people or some group of people or some individuals, they will prefer certain commodities based on their taste and preferences, and some are very clear that they are voting wherever they are whoever will come in the power and will give the tax exemption, or their income will be enhanced like through direct cash transfer or some tax exemptions. It could be at the individual's level, and it also could be at the corporate level or at the company level. So tax exemption, right? On the other hand, some people will only vote for based on some taste and preferences. Like just like commodity, like ice cream. Some people, even for ice cream, some people will like vanilla flavor or some will like chocolate flavor, and that is the taste and preference of the individuals over ice cream. So similarly, even for public policy, some people will go for better service in the school, primary school. Some people will actually prefer that, and some will prefer on the others. So here even individual preferences for public goods, this will be depending on taste and preferences and income and taxes. So these are the few points that one can actually really remember. So now let's move further, and that is the major point of discussion is the tax price and taxation. And tax is very important because tax is the source of the revenue for the government, and once government generate the revenue and government will spend, so and then budget will be allocated, right? So tax price means tax rate, and taxation are very, very important even for the budget's point of view. So there are couple of points here. So one is tax price and government expenditure, they are directly proportional. So if tax rate is increasing or tax price is increasing, there is general tendency that government will have more revenue and then government will spend more. So as you remember that we already we already introduced the grand macroeconomic equations, which is we call aggregate demand curve. We'll also discuss much more in details when we talk about macroeconomic elements in the public policy in our ensuing lectures. So where we know that capital Y, which is national output, is a function or the sum of consumption expenditure, investment expenditure and government expenditures. So this is in case of closed economy. So here when we are talking about government expenditures, so we are actually talking about this G, like capital G, and then how G is related to others. So it's basically if small t is the tax price or tax rate for the per unit of income. If t is increasing, then total tax capital, total tax revenue, like total tax revenue will also increase. If total revenue, tax revenue is increasing, like if total R is increasing, then obviously general tendency is like government expenditure will, in principle, government expenditure also should be more. So this means if revenue is more coming from tax collections, and then that revenue needs to be spent by the government through various programs. It could be government spending or could be government transfer. Government transfer is like through pensions or say some other social assistance programs. Government spending is basically on the say building roads, highways, or building national park, or any sort of, or building public health infrastructure or public good. So tax rate or tax price and government expenditure, they are positively or proportionately related to each other. So now a higher tax price by itself means that richer individuals would want to spend a lower level of the money on the public goods. So that is the first point, like higher tax price by itself means richer individuals, like those who are paying more would want to spend a lower level of money on public goods. Like they will always try to have, like just in case of tax exemption or lowering the tax. So if we know that if our taxes are becoming high, and that will be in general that will be higher for the government expenditure. So in order to get tax exemption, we will also try to kind of say that let's not spend much on the public goods, so that government spending will be less, and then that will be getting reflected in our tax rate. So income effects in this particular context is leads to a higher desired demand, and price effect leads to a lower desired level. So like price effect, like price of the taxes, and income is like income increasing of the individual's level, and or also at the national level. So there are two types of taxations. One is uniform taxations, like irrespective of this, everybody will be giving the similar amount of tax, same amount of tax. And proportional taxation is basically tagged with the income. As income increases, then taxes also will be increased, and therefore this is proportional, like poor people will pay less tax and rich people will be paying more tax. But in reality, in many of the cases it doesn't happen, and we also have seen, we also know that sometimes poor people, they end up paying more as compared to richer people or people who are getting into higher income slabs. So these are kind of the concept that we are going to use more in details, and then we will also discuss how it looks like. So now tax price, let us establish this relationship, like tax price and then individual payment. So assume that total number of people in the economy is like say capital N. So capital N number of people who are actually paying, will be paying the taxes. So their total number matters a lot. Then total government expenditure, like say imagine like capital G is the total government expenditures that in a year that government can actually spend on various activities, including physical and social infrastructure, and that is coming from say total number of population which is like capital N. So now each individual pays under uniform taxation, like total number of say government expenditure. So capital G is like total number of government expenditure, and that has to come from the tax revenue, and then total number of population, if you divide then this is like, each individual will pay under the uniform taxation. So like government expenditure, first we'll calculate, government will calculate total amount of expenditure that government needs to spend in the economy, and that's how the budget will be created. And then that G will be coming from the R, and R is basically the revenue, and then say revenue or say capital T is the tax, total tax revenue, and then once T will be equals to G, so in this particular case, like T has to be equals to G, and then and T is the tax revenue. When we get the total T, which is equals to G, and then this G will be spending, and therefore this is the amount of tax revenue that needs to be collected from total number of population, like say capital N. So whatever the total G will be, then simple, you just one is to divide by total number of population, and then we get the individual average tax payment. So it's basically, this is like nothing, is basically average tax payment for individual people. So now let's move, like if there is the condition, if average income of the household or individual, like say if average income say capital Y bar, if Y bar, and then total income for the entire population like capital N, it will be capital N Y bar. This is basically average income of an individual, and then total number of household or total number of population is like capital N. The total amount of income that we are getting it, like total income that is getting generated from n number of populations from their income will be capital N Y bar. So like total income accumulations. If tax rate is like small t that we denote, then total government revenue will be small t is like tax rate, total tax revenue from the Y bar income. So per unit income tax rate is small t, and total average average income of the individual is Y bar, and that is actually from per individual the total tax collection will be T Y bar, and then total number of population is like multiply by total number of n, like total number of population or the household, whatever we consider. Here we consider as people, like total, then n, then total revenue, government revenue will be small t n Y bar. So it's like tax that we are collecting at the rate of per unit taxes from average individual income, and then total number of populations like total n. So now we see that government expenditure, equilibrium conditions. Let us assume that what is the equilibrium conditions, and equilibrium conditions is government expenditure will be equals to government revenue, like G is equals to small t n Y bar, right? So this is what so we can write as small t here is like nothing, is like total revenue by, so this is how small t can be calculated, like small t, which is nothing, is like tax price, like per unit tax, and per unit tax can be defined with the ratio of government expenditure that government is need to spend, and like here we can say like budget announcement, like how much budget that government has to spend on the various activities, economic activities, especially in the on the public goods, and then total amount of income that actually get generated. It's nothing. So G to total income ratio, like expenditure to output ratio. This is nothing, and output here is N Y bar, total output. And then if we make it tax payment of an individual, and if we imagine like here YI can be represented as income per individual, then it can be written as TYI equals to GYI by NY bar. So this is what overall, like two final equation is, like say one is here and one is equation 2. So equation 1 shows the tax price, like per unit taxes, which is nothing, is basically the ratio of government expenditure to output. Equation 2 says that how individual will pay the overall tax, like Y is YI, like individual income level, like I could be 1 to n, like nth number of people there. So and T is a per person's tax, like per unit tax, and according to we'll get the total tax payment. So tax payment equation will be small t yi equals to nothing, is basically again government expenditure, product of government expenditure and individual income, which is associated with individual income, by NY, means total level of output. So I stop here in my this lecture. So thank you very much for your attentions, and we'll continue our discussion in my next lecture.